is being given to claims for civil damages against companies implicated in state capture and to ban them from doing business with the state. In addition to the people and companies named in the Commission's report, analysis by the Financial Intelligence Center has identified a further 595 individuals and 1,044 entities that may be implicated in the flow of funds from state capture. Relevant information has been compiled into reports to various law enforcement agencies, other bodies like the State Security Agency, the South African Reserve Bank, the Public Protector, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, and the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, and a number of law enforcement agencies in other countries. In addition to recommending actions against the perpetrators of state capture, the Commission made 95 recommendations that would require constitutional, legislative, regulatory, and operational changes. It also made recommendations on the establishment of new institutions. I'd like to outline here some of the key reforms that government is taking in response to the Commission's recommendations. The Commission made detailed recommendations about the establishment of an independent public procurement anti-corruption agency. It also recommended the establishment of a permanent anti-corruption commission that would have oversight over both Parliament and the Executive. The Commission's recommendations underline the need for a coherent and integrated approach to combating corruption, fraud, and maladministration. It is therefore appropriate that these recommendations form part of a fundamental redesign and review of the country's anti-corruption architecture. Based on the advice of the recently appointed National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council and the outcomes of a review of our anti-corruption architecture by the Department of Justice, a comprehensive proposal on an effective and integrated anti-corruption institutional framework will be produced for public consultation, finalization, and implementation. To address concerns about the independence of the NPA, legislative amendments will introduce greater transparency and consultation in the selection and appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. This will draw on the process that we adopted for the selection of the current NDPP. The State Capture Commission made several detailed recommendations with respect to procurement reform, which we support and accept and are working to put into effect. The abuse of the procurement system was one of the main ways that taxpayer funds were illicitly diverted to private interests instead of providing value to the people of our country. The Public Procurement Bill, which is expected to be finalized and submitted to Parliament by March 2023, will address many of the Commission's recommendations. These recommendations include the introduction of a code of conduct setting out the ethical standards for procurement, protecting accounting officers from criminal or civil liability for acting in good faith, harmonization of public procurement legislation, making procurement more transparent, and establishing a professional body for public procurement officials. As recommended by the Commission, lifestyle audits for the President, Deputy President, Ministers and Deputy Ministers is being managed by the Director General in the Presidency and undertaken by an independent external service provider. The Commission found that the appointment and removal of board members and senior executives in state-owned enterprises was one of the key causes of state capture. The lack of compliance, transparency, and accountability in the appointment of board members did not only enable the capture of these companies, but also contributed to a decline in their operational and financial performance. That is why government accepts the Commission's recommendations on the need for a process for the appointment of boards of state-owned enterprises that is not open to manipulation. This would include the involvement of independent panels with appropriate technical expertise to recommend suitable candidates to the relevant minister. No board member will be allowed to be involved in procurement processes, as has happened during the state capture period, beyond playing an oversight role. Ministers will be prohibited from playing any role in procurement within state-owned enterprises or departments. The State Capture Commission recommended the establishment of a commission of inquiry into the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA, because the Commission said it has an uneasy perception that there is much about the ills at PRASA that has not yet been uncovered. Close quotes. Our view is that the establishment of a further commission of inquiry into PRASA must be considered against existing initiatives that are probing the collapse of PRASA. There are currently investigations into PRASA by the Hawks and a wide-ranging probe by the Special Investigating Unit, including investigating governance and maladministration. I'd like to wait the outcome of those investigations before deciding on the establishment of a commission of inquiry. The State Capture Commission also exposes the central role that private sector actors played in state capture, both through direct involvement in procurement corruption, fraud and money laundering, but also in weakening institutions that stood in the way of state capture. These perpetrators included management consultants, both local and foreign, advisors, accountants, auditors, lawyers, bankers, as well as providers of goods and services, including large multinational firms. To address some of the abuses by private companies, amendments will be made to laws currently under review to, among others, criminalize donations to political parties in expectation of state contracts, to bar suppliers who have engaged in dishonest or corrupt behavior, and to make failure to prevent bribery an offense. The Commission investigated various allegations of illegal activities and abuse of state resources at the State Security Agency. The Commission found that weaknesses in our intelligence services regulatory framework made them particularly vulnerable to abuse for political and personal gain. We will implement all the Commission's extensive recommendations on the intelligence services together with the recommendations of the high-level review panel on the SSA chaired by Professor Sidney Mufamadi. A new General Intelligence Law Amendment Bill will implement many of the Commission's recommendations, including establishing separate domestic and foreign intelligence services, improving oversight of intelligence agencies, and giving practical effect to the principle that no member of the executive responsible for intelligence may be involved in the operational matters of the SSA. The Commission identified whistleblowing as an essential weapon in the fight against corruption. The actions of whistleblowers have played a vital role in exposing many of the activities that were part of state capture. Whistleblowers need to be encouraged to report instances of fraud and corruption and need to be protected from victimization, prejudice, or harm. The Department of Justice is reviewing the Protected Disclosures Act and Witness Protection Act to give effect to the Commission's recommendations on the protection of whistleblowers. This will ensure, among others, that whistleblowers receive the protections afforded by the UN Convention Against Corruption and that whistleblowers have immunity from criminal or civil action arising from honest disclosures. The Commission made recommendations for the consideration of far-reaching reforms to the country's electoral system. These reforms include the direct election of the president by the population and the adoption of a constituency-based but still proportionally representative electoral system. These proposals are meant to address weaknesses in the ability of Parliament and its elected officials to provide sufficient oversight to prevent state capture. Due to the far-reaching consequences of the recommendations on the electoral reform and the fact that they would require constitutional amendments, it is appropriate that they are considered by the political parties represented in our Parliament and form part of an extensive process of consultation that involves the society as a whole. These consultations should take into account of the broad-based engagement as well as views that were expressed by our people right across the country in the drafting of our Constitution. The State Capture Commission made certain observations with respect to the responsibility of the President and Premiers for the actions and failures of ministers, deputy ministers and MECs respectively. The Commission made the fundamental point that persons who occupy positions in government must be people of integrity who conduct themselves ethically and in compliance with the law. Therefore, in exercising my powers with respect to members of the Executive, I am required to consider the Commission's findings, recommendations, and observations about particular individuals. In this regard, I am attending to the Commission's recommendations and observations on members of the Executive against whom adverse findings were made. The Commission found that in several instances, Parliament had not been effective in holding the Executive to account. It made several recommendations to remedy the shortcomings that it identified. Some of these recommendations had to do with Parliament's internal arrangements, such as the chairing of portfolio committees, while others related to Parliament's interface with the Executive and how to ensure that ministers account to Parliament fully and regularly. In giving consideration to these recommendations, we are mindful of the separation of powers and the right of Parliament to determine its own rules and arrangements within the provisions of our Constitution. In this regard, Deputy President David Mabuza, who is the leader of government business, will interact with Parliament's presiding officers on the Commission's recommendations on the interface between Parliament and the Executive. To ensure that Parliament is sufficiently resourced to hold the Executive to account, the National Treasury will engage with Parliament to determine the most appropriate way to give effect to the Commission's recommendations on the funding of Parliament. If we are to successfully end state capture and turn the tide on corruption, the actions set out in my response to the State Capture Commission will require dedicated coordination and effective implementation. In this regard, I've directed various departments in government, ministers, to ensure that there is full implementation. Progress will be closely monitored and regularly communicated. All sections of society will also be engaged and involved in the implementation of the actions to give effect to the recommendations of the Commission. In conclusion, let me express on behalf of the people of our country our profound gratitude to the dedication and wisdom with which Chief Justice Raymond Zondo led this Commission. We once again extend our gratitude to the Secretary of the Commission, the heads of the investigation and legal teams, the evidence leaders, the researchers, and other Commission staff. We recognize the contribution of the former Public Protector Advocate Thuli Madonsela, whose initial investigation into allegations of state capture laid the foundation for the establishment of the State Capture Commission. The submission of this response to Parliament gives full effect to the remedial actions contained in the Public Protector's Report of November 2016. While it marks the end of a chapter in our country's history, the hard work to restore our country, repair our institutions, and rebuild our trust in each other still lies ahead. This administration is firmly committed to undertake this task, to combat corruption in all its forms, in every part of government and in every sphere of the state. Where corruption has occurred, for example, in the procurement of the COVID-19 related goods, we acted swiftly to prosecute those responsible and recover stolen funds. This has been made possible in large part due to our efforts to strengthen the South African Police Service, the Hawks, the National Prosecuting Authority, the South African Revenue Service, SARS, the Financial Intelligence Center, the Special Investigating Unit, and other important agencies. This stands in stark contrast to the period of state capture, where perpetrators were able to act with impunity, confident that they would not face the consequences of their actions. This is no longer the case. The people of South Africa are tired of corruption and want it to end. Those who are involved in corruption, or who are even thinking about engaging in criminal conduct, must know that all the instruments of the state will be used to bring them to book. There will be no place for corrupt people, for criminal networks, for perpetrators of state capture to hide. Now that our response to State Capture Commission has been submitted to Parliament, we look forward to the deliberations and suggestions of members of Parliament and from across society as we take forward the recommendations of this Commission. As a country, we are emerging from a very dark and difficult period. Together, we have chosen a path of rebuilding, a path of renewal, a path of transparency and accountability, and a path of justice and the rule of law. I have every confidence that no matter the challenges, we will walk this path together and we will prevail because we are South Africans. I thank you. May God bless South Africa. Good night.